On the 4th of June, 1942, the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean to illuminate what would become the graveyard of Japanese naval supremacy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, 700 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, confident that his meticulously planned operation would deliver another crushing victory to the Imperial Japanese Navy. His confidence was not misplaced by arrogance, but forged in the crucible of 6 months of unbroken triumph across the Pacific. Yet what Yamamoto could not see, what his entire strategic philosophy could not accommodate, was that the Americans had already shattered the fundamental assumption upon which his entire war logic rested. The Japanese military establishment had built its Pacific strategy on a foundation of predictable patterns and calculated risk. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, the Imperial Navy had operated under a doctrine that assumed technological superiority, tactical excellence, and above all the element of surprise would guarantee victory. The fall of Hong Kong, the conquest of the Philippines, the humiliation of British forces at Singapore, each success reinforced the belief that warfare was a mathematical equation where superior training and material preparation would always triumph over chaos. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, embodied this philosophy perfectly. He had studied American carrier tactics for years, memorized their doctrine, and predicted their responses with almost academic precision. The Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima had produced generations of officers trained to see warfare as a complex, but ultimately solvable problem. Every contingency had a prepared response, every American tactic a predetermined counter. The notion that unpredictability itself could become a weapon was foreign to their entire strategic culture. According to research compiled by historians at the Naval War College and referenced in Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully's comprehensive study, Shattered Sword, the Japanese operational planning for Midway reflected this rigid worldview. The plan involved 8 separate task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean, each moving according to precise timetables. Yamamoto's staff had wargamed the operation repeatedly, but always within parameters that assumed Japanese control of information and American adherence to predictable defensive patterns. The Americans, however, had introduced a variable that Japanese planners never seriously considered: broken codes and complete intelligence penetration. Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysis team at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked the Japanese naval code designated JN-25, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz an unprecedented window into enemy intentions. This was not merely an advantage, it was a fundamental inversion of the strategic paradigm upon which Japanese confidence rested. But intelligence alone did not explain what was about to unfold. The Japanese war machine had prepared for American strength, American courage, even American desperation. What it had not prepared for was American unpredictability, the willingness to abandon doctrine, to gamble everything on timing that defied conservative naval thinking, to embrace chaos as a tactical principle. As the Japanese carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo approached Midway that morning, they sailed not just toward an American trap, but toward the complete dissolution of their logical framework for conducting war. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had commanded the Kido Butai, the elite carrier strike force, through every major operation since Pearl Harbor. On the morning of the 4th of June, his 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most powerful concentrated naval striking force on Earth. Their crews were veterans, their aircraft the finest in the Pacific, their doctrine proven through 6 months of uninterrupted victory. Yet Nagumo operated within a cognitive framework that made certain assumptions about how battles developed, how enemies responded, and critically, how information flowed during combat operations. Japanese naval doctrine assumed that reconnaissance would provide adequate warning of enemy movements. The pre-dawn launch of search planes was a routine procedure, designed to sweep sectors of ocean and report back anything unusual. On this particular morning, one of those scout planes, a float plane from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction. This single mechanical failure would cascade through the entire operation, But more importantly, it revealed how Japanese planning depended on everything working according to schedule. There was no doctrine for what to do when the fundamental assumptions about information gathering collapsed. At 0430 hours, Nagumo launched his strike force against Midway Atoll itself, 108 aircraft thundering off the carrier decks in the pre-dawn darkness. The mission was straightforward: suppress American air power on the island, prepare it for invasion. The plan allocated specific aircraft to this mission because Japanese logistics, unlike American practice, carefully calculated every bomb and torpedo. Flexibility was sacrificed for efficiency. Each aircraft had its designated role, and changing that role mid-operation meant physically rearming planes on the hangar decks, a time-consuming process that would prove catastrophic. The strike on Midway encountered more resistance than expected. American Marine pilots, flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, threw themselves against the Japanese formation with suicidal courage. Though they were slaughtered, losing 17 of 26 fighters, they disrupted the attack and inflicted enough damage that Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the strike, radioed back at 0700 hours with a message that would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack wave. Nagumo faced a decision, but it was not the kind of decision Japanese doctrine prepared officers to make under pressure. He had held back 93 aircraft as a reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against any American warships that might appear. Tominaga's message suggested he should rearm these aircraft with land attack weapons for another strike on Midway. The doctrine said, eliminate land-based threats before engaging naval forces. But the doctrine also said, maintain strike capability against enemy carriers. These two principles now contradicted each other. At 0715 hours, Nagumo gave the order to rearm the reserve aircraft for a second attack on Midway. Crews began the laborious process of bringing planes up from the hangar decks, removing torpedoes, loading general-purpose bombs. It was methodical, careful, efficient, everything Japanese naval practice valued. What it was not was fast, and what it could not accommodate was radical uncertainty about where American carriers might be. At 0728 hours, just 13 minutes after Nagumo's rearming order, the delayed scout plane from the Tone finally reported sighting American ships. The report was vague. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's entire framework for understanding the battle now shattered. American surface ships were not supposed to be here. The intelligence estimates said the American carriers were near Hawaii, at least 2 days away. Yet here was a contact report that might include carriers. The message from the Tone scout plane hung in the air of Akagi's bridge like an accusation. Nagumo and his staff stared at the plot, their carefully constructed operational timeline beginning to fracture. Japanese naval doctrine provided clear guidance for battles fought according to predictable sequences. Locate the enemy, mass your forces, deliver a concentrated strike. But the doctrine had no answer for what to do when you discovered the enemy was already positioned to strike you while your own strike force was scattered. Some attacking Midway, some being rearmed below decks, and none ready for immediate launch against warships. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer, had advocated before the battle for concentrating all Japanese carriers in a single formation, rather than dispersing forces across Yamamoto's complex multi-pronged plan. But Genda himself lay sick with fever in his cabin, unable to provide the aggressive counsel that might have cut through Nagumo's paralysis. The Japanese command structure, for all its professional excellence, did not encourage junior officers to forcefully challenge their superiors' decisions in moments of crisis. At 0745 hours, Nagumo made a decision that seemed logical within his framework. He ordered the scout plane to ascertain the ship types. This was textbook procedure: gather complete information before committing forces. But it was also a decision that assumed time was available, that the Americans would behave according to the same methodical doctrine that governed Japanese operations. Nagumo could not conceive that Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American carriers Enterprise and Hornet, had already made a decision that violated every conservative principle in the naval warfare textbook. Spruance had launched his strike at 0702 hours, when the Japanese carriers were still at the absolute maximum range of his aircraft. This was not a calculated risk. It was a desperate gamble that defied doctrine. American Navy doctrine emphasized launching coordinated strikes from closer range, ensuring fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes all arrived together. Spruance threw this out entirely. He launched everything he had at a range where many aircraft would not have enough fuel to return, betting that surprise and aggression would matter more than coordination, or even survival. The Japanese could not predict this because it was fundamentally irrational by their standards of warfare. Japanese pilots were the most highly trained in the world, products of a brutal selection process that took years to complete. The notion of sending them on missions where fuel calculations made survival uncertain was anathema to Japanese operational thinking. Americans, with their massive training programs and assembly line approach to pilot production, could afford to be wasteful with human resources in ways that Japan could not. At 0809 hours, the Tone Scout finally reported, "The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." Nagumo's worst fear was confirmed, but now he faced a dilemma that his training had not prepared him to solve. His reserve aircraft were halfway through being rearmed with land bombs. The strike force returning from Midway would need to land soon. They were low on fuel. And somewhere out there, American carriers were preparing to strike, though he did not know how close they were or when they might arrive. The logical decision, the decision any staff college would have endorsed, was to clear the decks, recover the Midway strike force, properly rearm all aircraft with anti-ship weapons, refuel them, and then launch a massive coordinated attack. This would take approximately 90 minutes, but it would deliver the kind of overwhelming strike that had destroyed the American battleship force at Pearl Harbor. Nagumo ordered it done, believing he had time because American doctrine would require them to close the range before launching their own strike. He was applying logic to an enemy who had abandoned logic for desperation. At 0830 hours, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet toward the Japanese fleet. Waldron commanded Torpedo Squadron 8, and he was about to lead his men into what every participant understood was almost certain death. The Devastator was already obsolete, slow, poorly armored, carrying a torpedo that frequently malfunctioned. Against the Japanese combat air patrol of 0 fighters, and without fighter escort, these aircraft had virtually no chance of survival. Yet Waldron flew on because unpredictability in warfare sometimes means accepting missions that rational calculation would reject. The Japanese carriers were still recovering the Midway strike force when Waldron's squadron appeared on the horizon. Nagumo's worst nightmare was materializing. He was being attacked while his decks were crowded with returning aircraft, and his reserve strike force was still being rearmed below. The 0 fighters on combat air patrol dove on Waldron's torpedo bombers with methodical efficiency. Within minutes, all 15 Devastators were shot down. Not one torpedo hit its target. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean in his life jacket, watching the battle unfold around him. To Japanese observers, this attack confirmed their doctrine. The Americans had sent an uncoordinated, poorly executed strike that was destroyed without effect. The Japanese defensive system had worked exactly as designed. The lookouts and officers on the carrier bridges relaxed slightly. They had weathered the attack. Now they could finish preparations and launch their own devastating counterstrike. What they did not realize was that Torpedo Squadron 8 had accomplished something that no successful attack could have achieved. It had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level and scattered the defensive formations across the sky. At 0920 hours, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 more Devastators from Enterprise toward the Japanese carriers. His squadron met the same fate as Waldron's. 10 of 14 aircraft shot down, no hits achieved. The Japanese fighter directors were now managing multiple intercepts, their Zeros burning fuel at prodigious rates as they dove and climbed repeatedly. The pattern seemed clear. The Americans were throwing poorly coordinated attacks at the Kido Butai in desperation, and each attack was being systematically destroyed. Japanese tactical doctrine was proving its superiority with mathematical precision. But doctrine is a framework for predictable situations, and what was about to happen had no precedent in naval warfare. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie was leading 33 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown, and through a combination of navigation skill and extraordinary luck, his squadrons arrived over the Japanese fleet at 0922 hours, just as the last Japanese fighters were shooting down Lindsay's torpedo bombers at sea level. The sky above the Japanese carriers was empty. Leslie's pilots looked down and saw 4 carriers sailing in formation, their decks packed with aircraft being fueled and armed. It was every dive bomber pilot's dream: concentrated, vulnerable targets with no fighter cover. The Japanese had no doctrine for this situation because it should have been impossible. Their combat air patrol should have been positioned at altitude. Their radar-less detection system relied on lookouts who were now focused on the sea-level torpedo attacks. Every element of Japanese defensive doctrine was oriented toward the last threat, not the next one. According to historical accounts compiled by military historians and preserved in the archives of the Naval History and Heritage Command, what happened next occurred in approximately 6 minutes. Leslie's dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs, plummeting toward the Japanese carriers at 400 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but the gunners were tracking targets at the wrong altitude. The first bomb struck Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, penetrating the flight deck near the amidships elevator and detonating in the hangar deck, where fully fueled and armed aircraft were preparing for launch. The explosion that followed was not just physical but philosophical. Japanese war logic depended on concentration of force, careful timing, and methodical execution. But unpredictability had introduced a variable that no amount of planning could anticipate: simultaneity of chaos. Within 2 minutes, Kaga was also hit, massive explosions ripping through her hangar deck. At 0925 hours, Soryu took 3 bombs in rapid succession. 3 of the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai were transformed from instruments of precision warfare into floating funeral pyres in less time than it took to explain what had happened. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from appendicitis aboard Akagi, was thrown from his bunk by the first bomb hit. He struggled to the deck to find his flagship transformed into an inferno. What stunned him was not the destruction itself. He was a veteran of brutal air combat, but the speed with which order had dissolved into chaos. One moment, Akagi had been the floating headquarters of the most powerful carrier force ever assembled. The next, it was a burning wreck with secondary explosions throwing aircraft and men into the sea. Japanese damage control doctrine was excellent. Their crews were trained to fight fires and contain flooding with systematic efficiency. But doctrine assumed controllable damage, isolated fires, time to implement procedures. The bombs that struck the Japanese carriers had hit at the precise moment when their hangars were filled with fueled and armed aircraft. Torpedoes and bombs that had been removed during rearming operations were stacked on the hangar decks. Aviation fuel lines were open. It was a perfect storm of volatile materials waiting for ignition, and when it came, no amount of training or procedure could contain it. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching his flagship die beneath him. He was a cautious officer, promoted through seniority rather than aggressive brilliance, and now he faced a situation that no cautious calculation could resolve. His staff officers were urging him to transfer his flag to another ship and continue commanding the battle. But Nagumo seemed paralyzed. The destruction of his meticulously planned operation in a matter of minutes had shattered something deeper than tactical cohesion. It had demolished the assumption that warfare was controllable through proper procedure and training. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, finally insisted that the admiral abandon ship. At 10:46 hours, Nagumo climbed down a rope to a boat, leaving his burning flagship behind. He transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, but he was now commanding a battle without the tools of command. He had no flight decks, no strike capability, and increasingly, no communications network. The Japanese Navy had built its entire operational system around carrier air power, and with 3 carriers burning, that system was collapsing. Only Hiryu remained operational, and her captain, Tomeo Kaku, immediately prepared a counterstrike. Here was a Japanese officer behaving according to doctrine, aggressive, immediate retaliation against the enemy carriers. At 10:54 hours, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu, following the retreating American aircraft back toward their carriers. This was precisely the kind of response Japanese doctrine prescribed. Locate the enemy, strike swiftly, destroy his capability before he could strike again. The Japanese pilots from Hiryu found the American carrier Yorktown and pressed home their attack with the skill and courage that had made them legends. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, penetrating deep into the ship and starting fires. American damage control parties fought to save their ship, but at 14:30 hours, a second strike from Hiryu, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The carrier began to list heavily and her captain ordered abandon ship. The Japanese counterstrike had succeeded. For a brief moment it seemed as though Japanese tactical excellence might salvage something from the disaster. Hiryu's pilots had proven that skill and aggression could still achieve results. But the fundamental mathematics of the battle had already shifted. The Americans had 3 carriers in the battle: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Even with Yorktown crippled, they still had 2 operational carriers. The Japanese now had only Hiryu, and the Americans knew where she was. At 16:45 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. The Japanese carrier tried desperately to evade, her captain maneuvering with skill and determination. But unpredictability cuts both ways. One of the American pilots, badly wounded and barely conscious, released his bomb in what he later described as a semi-conscious act, rather than a deliberate attack. The bomb hit Hiryu's forward elevator, and within minutes, the last operational Japanese carrier was burning as fiercely as her 3 sister ships. By sunset on the 4th of June, 1942, the Kido Butai had ceased to exist. Admiral Yamamoto, still aboard the super battleship Yamato hundreds of miles to the northwest, received the reports of carrier losses with stunned disbelief. The architect of Pearl Harbor had designed the Midway operation as a complex chess game with multiple moving pieces, each force positioned to support the others according to a precise timeline. The American carriers were supposed to rush to Midway's defense and be destroyed by the overwhelming concentration of Japanese naval power. Instead, the Americans had somehow positioned themselves to strike first, and they had done so with a timing and ferocity that violated every assumption about their capabilities. What Yamamoto could not fully grasp in those first hours was that he had lost more than 4 carriers. He had lost the foundation of Japan's entire Pacific strategy. The Imperial Navy had begun the war with 10 carriers. In 6 months, they had lost 1 small carrier at Coral Sea. Now, in a single day, they had lost 4 fleet carriers, including all 4 that had struck Pearl Harbor. The trained pilots lost were irreplaceable, products of a pre-war training system that took years to produce qualified carrier aviators. Japan could potentially build new carriers, but it could not quickly rebuild the human expertise that had made the Kido Butai so formidable. More fundamentally, Yamamoto had lost something he had always feared losing: the initiative. Japanese war planning had always assumed that offense would be better than defense, that by striking first and maintaining aggressive momentum, Japan could force favorable terms before America's industrial superiority became decisive. The plan had been to create a defensive perimeter across the Pacific that would be too costly for the Americans to penetrate. Midway was supposed to extend that perimeter and eliminate the American carrier threat in the process. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division aboard Hiryu, had sent a message before his carrier was destroyed: "We are prepared to sacrifice ourselves to attack the enemy carriers." Yamaguchi embodied the aggressive spirit that had carried Japan through 6 months of victories. Even facing impossible odds, he wanted to attack. But after Hiryu was hit, there was nothing left to attack with. Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, standing on the bridge as the flames consumed her. His death symbolized more than personal courage. It represented the extinction of the offensive capability that had given Japan its early war advantage. Commander Yahachi Tanabe, commanding the submarine I-168, provided the only Japanese tactical success of the entire battle when his torpedoes finally sank the already crippled Yorktown on the 7th of June. But one American carrier, already damaged and abandoned, could not balance the loss of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and their air groups. The strategic equation had fundamentally shifted, and no amount of submarine success could restore Japanese offensive capability in the Central Pacific. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, evacuated from the burning Akagi, spent the days after the battle trying to understand what had happened. He had been the primary architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, a master of the calculated strike. But Midway had demonstrated something that challenged his entire professional worldview. Sometimes warfare is not about calculation, but about chaos. Not about executing plans, but about adapting to unpredictability faster than your opponent can. The Americans had not won through superior planning. Their attacks had been poorly coordinated. Many aircraft had been lost to navigation errors. Entire squadrons had failed to find targets. They had won through persistence, aggression, and a willingness to embrace tactical disorder in service of strategic objectives. The Japanese military culture emphasized harmony, coordination, and flawless execution. These were strengths, but at Midway they became liabilities. The Japanese could not adapt quickly enough when their careful plans disintegrated. They could not embrace chaos as a weapon because their entire training emphasized eliminating chaos through superior preparation. When unpredictability became the dominant factor in the battle, the very excellence of Japanese training became a cognitive trap. They kept trying to restore order and control when the winning strategy was to accept disorder and adapt faster than the enemy. Japanese naval officers analyzing the battle in the months that followed identified numerous tactical errors. The scout plane that launched late, the decision to rearm aircraft for a second Midway strike, the failure to have adequate combat air patrol at altitude. But these analyses missed the deeper problem. Their entire strategic framework assumed predictability, and when faced with fundamental unpredictability, no amount of tactical excellence could compensate. In the weeks following Midway, the Japanese High Command made a decision that revealed how deeply the battle had shaken their strategic confidence. They classified the defeat as a state secret. Newspapers were forbidden to report the carrier losses. Families of dead sailors were told their loved ones had died in training accidents. Even within the military, information about the disaster was carefully controlled. This was not merely propaganda. It was an institutional refusal to confront the implications of what had happened. Commander Fuchida, recovering from his injuries, was ordered to brief senior staff officers on the battle. He described the tactical sequence of events but struggled to explain why the Americans had attacked when and how they did. The American tactics made no sense within Japanese doctrinal understanding. Launching at extreme range, sending in uncoordinated attacks, sacrificing entire squadrons. These were not the actions of a professional navy operating according to sound principles. Yet they had worked. This paradox haunted the Japanese naval staff. Some officers argued that Midway was simply bad luck, a series of unfortunate coincidences that had aligned against Japanese forces. The late launching scout plane, the timing of the American dive bomber attack, even the fact that the bombs hit when aircraft were being rearmed, all of these could be framed as probability rather than systematic failure. This interpretation was comforting because it suggested that better luck next time would restore Japanese advantages. It was also completely wrong. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, whose submarine had sunk Yorktown, was celebrated as a hero. But he privately understood that the submarine service's contribution was irrelevant to the strategic outcome. Japan had lost the battle in the 6 minutes when American dive bombers struck 3 carriers. Everything afterward, including his successful attack, was merely epilogue to a story that had already concluded. But the Japanese command structure preferred to celebrate Tanabe's success rather than confront the devastating implications of the carrier losses. The Japanese Navy's construction program accelerated after Midway, with orders placed for new carriers to replace those lost. But shipbuilding takes years, and pilot training takes longer still. The replacements would not arrive in time to affect the war's trajectory. Meanwhile, American shipyards were launching a new Essex-class fleet carrier every few months, and American training programs were producing thousands of new pilots annually. The industrial and demographic advantages that Yamamoto had always feared were now becoming operational realities, more insidiously. Midway altered Japanese strategic thinking in ways that would compound the defeat. With the carrier force decimated, the Imperial Navy fell back on defensive operations and conservative tactics. The aggressive doctrine that had characterized the first 6 months of the war gave way to caution and preservation of remaining forces. But warfare rewards aggression, especially when fighting against an opponent with greater resources. By becoming more conservative, Japan surrendered the only advantage it had ever possessed: the initiative gained through skilled, aggressive operations. Admiral Yamamoto remained in command of the combined fleet, but colleagues noticed a change in his demeanor. The confident strategist who had planned Pearl Harbor became more subdued, less certain. He continued to seek the decisive battle that would force favorable terms, but he never again found the opportunity. His death on the 18th of April 1943, when his aircraft was intercepted and shot down by American fighters, guided to their target by broken Japanese codes, was symbolically appropriate. He had spent his career believing in decisive battles and calculated risks, and he died because the Americans had broken the codes that made his movements predictable. The broken codes were perhaps the perfect metaphor for what had happened to Japanese war logic. They had assumed their communications were secure, just as they had assumed their tactics were superior and their operations unpredictable to the enemy. But the Americans had rendered Japanese planning transparent while making their own responses opaque. Unpredictability had become a weapon, and Japan had no doctrine for defending against it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood what he had won at Midway, even if his victory had come through methods that made his staff officers nervous. The battle had been an enormous gamble that violated conservative naval doctrine at every level. He had committed his carriers based on intelligence that might have been deception. He had launched strikes at maximum range that sacrificed coordination and even survival probability for timing and surprise. He had accepted catastrophic losses in torpedo squadrons because he understood that attrition of Japanese striking power mattered more than conservation of American forces. Nimitz's staff had included cautious voices arguing for more careful approaches, waiting until the Japanese intentions were clearer, launching strikes from more conservative ranges. If Nimitz had listened to these voices, the battle would likely have been much different, possibly a Japanese victory. But Nimitz had grasped something essential about warfare against a skilled opponent. Predictability is dangerous. The Japanese expected Americans to be cautious, professional, and doctrinally sound. So Nimitz threw out the doctrine and embraced calculated recklessness. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who had led Torpedo Squadron 8 to destruction, left behind a letter to his wife that revealed his understanding of what he and his men were being asked to do. He wrote, "If we run out of gas, we will land on water. There is nothing to worry about. This is the real thing." Waldron knew the mission was likely suicidal, but he also understood that their sacrifice might create opportunities for others. He was right. The torpedo squadrons achieved almost nothing directly, but they made the dive bomber attacks possible by disrupting Japanese defenses at the critical moment. This was a kind of warfare that Japanese doctrine could not accommodate. The Japanese valued their elite pilots and would not send them on missions where losses were virtually certain. But the Americans, with their massive training programs and industrial capacity, could afford to be what the Japanese considered wasteful with human resources. This was not callousness. It was a different calculation about how to achieve strategic objectives. The Americans understood that winning the war mattered more than minimizing casualties in individual battles. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent hours floating in the Pacific watching the battle unfold. He saw the Japanese carriers burning, saw aircraft from both sides fighting overhead, saw the progression of a battle that he had helped shape through his squadron's sacrifice. Years later, he would struggle to explain the mixture of emotions he felt: pride in his squadron's courage, grief for his lost comrades, and a strange satisfaction that their deaths had mattered. His testimony provided historians with unique insights into how the battle had developed, but more importantly, it illustrated the human cost of strategic unpredictability. The dive bomber pilots who had actually sunk the Japanese carriers, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, and their squadrons, received medals and recognition. But they understood that their success had been enabled by forces beyond their control, intelligence that had positioned the fleet correctly, timing that brought them over the targets at the perfect moment, and the sacrifices of torpedo squadrons that had disrupted Japanese defenses. Warfare at this level was not about individual heroism, but about systems and timing, and a willingness to accept chaos as a tactical tool. In Washington, strategists analyzing the battle struggled to extract clear lessons. The official doctrine said strikes should be coordinated, launched from moderate ranges, and carefully planned. Midway had violated all these principles and succeeded. Should the success be interpreted as validating the violations, or as demonstrating that desperate circumstances sometimes require desperate measures? The debate would continue throughout the war, but the real lesson was simpler. Rigid doctrine is a liability against adaptive enemies. The Japanese, meanwhile, were conducting their own analysis, but through a lens that prevented them from seeing the most important lessons. They cataloged tactical errors and equipment failures, but they could not acknowledge that their fundamental approach to warfare, the emphasis on flawless execution, the assumption of predictability, the belief that superior training would always prevail, had been defeated not by better American planning, but by American willingness to embrace chaos and uncertainty as weapons in themselves. By December of 1942, 6 months after Midway, the strategic situation in the Pacific had fundamentally transformed. American Marines landed at Guadalcanal, beginning a campaign that would slowly grind down Japanese forces through attrition and logistics rather than decisive battle. The Japanese Navy, still powerful but now operating without the carrier dominance that had defined the war's opening phase, found itself fighting a defensive campaign for which its doctrine and training had never prepared it. Admiral Nimitz would later reflect that Midway was the battle of calculated risks. But this understated the reality. Midway was the battle where unpredictability defeated calculation, where chaos overcame order, where a willingness to abandon doctrine proved superior to flawless execution of established procedures. These lessons would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The Japanese never rebuilt the Kido Butai's striking power. New carriers entered service. Junyo, Hyo, Taiho, Shokaku survived Midway only to be sunk later, but they never again achieved the concentration of trained pilots and coordinated air groups that had made the original force so formidable. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to embrace tactical innovation and operational flexibility. By 1944, fast carrier task forces were operating with a freedom and aggression that would have seemed impossible in 1942. Commander Fuchida survived the war and spent decades analyzing what had happened at Midway. He wrote extensively about the tactical details but never quite grasped the philosophical dimension of the defeat. He blamed the late-launching scout plane, poor decisions about rearming aircraft, inadequate combat air patrol procedures. He never acknowledged that these tactical failures were symptoms of a deeper strategic rigidity, the assumption that warfare could be controlled through superior planning, and that enemies would behave predictably. The 4 Japanese carriers lost at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented more than tonnage and aircraft. They embodied a philosophy of warfare that emphasized precision, training, and calculated risk within predictable parameters. Their destruction in a matter of minutes demonstrated that in modern warfare, unpredictability itself had become a weapon more powerful than any number of carefully trained pilots or meticulously maintained aircraft. The Americans who fought at Midway went on to fight in countless other battles. Many died in subsequent engagements. Some, like Admiral Spruance, would command fleets in even larger battles. Ensign Gay eventually returned to combat flying. The survivors carried with them the knowledge that courage and sacrifice matter, but so does timing, luck, and the willingness to gamble everything on decisions that doctrine would condemn as reckless. In Tokyo, the families who lost sons at Midway often never learned the truth about how they died. The official secrecy meant that the battle's lessons were never properly absorbed by Japanese society or even by much of its military. The institutional inability to confront uncomfortable truths, to admit that fundamental strategic assumptions had been wrong, prevented Japan from adapting effectively to the changed circumstances of the war. Admiral Yamamoto's death in April of 1943 eliminated the one Japanese leader who might have fully understood what Midway meant. He had always feared American industrial power, and he had designed Japanese strategy to win before that power became decisive. Midway proved that even brilliant planning could not overcome unpredictability, and that America's material advantages could be leveraged through operational flexibility and tactical innovation. The Battle of Midway did not end World War II. That would take 3 more years of brutal fighting across the Pacific and the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. But Midway ended Japanese strategic initiative and demonstrated that Japan's war logic, built on assumptions of predictability, superior training, and calculated operations, could not withstand an enemy willing to embrace chaos and uncertainty as tactical principles. On the 4th of June, 1942, the sun rose over 4 Japanese carriers steaming confidently toward what they believed would be another calculated victory. By sunset, those carriers were sinking wrecks, their admiral humiliated, their elite air groups destroyed. The battle had lasted only a few hours, but it had shattered a paradigm. Japan's war logic had collapsed not through superior American planning, but through unpredictability, the willingness to gamble, to attack at impossible ranges, to sacrifice coordination for timing, to embrace chaos when doctrine demanded order. In the end, warfare proved to be not an equation to be solved, but a storm to be weathered, and the Americans had brought the storm while the Japanese were still calculating probabilities.